Thank you for watching The Thought Criminals, which is the Orwellian named show starring me, your co-host, and your other co-host, Ralph Benko. Ralph Benko is the co-founder and chair of the 180,000 Capitalist League on Facebook. He's the co-author of the Capitalist Manifesto and a weekly contributor to Newsmax. I am a weekly contributor to Townhall. And this week, we are going to discuss an article I wrote about how I am sick and tired of the left using the tactic of ridicule, one of Saul Alinsky's rules for radicals, to destroy people on the right, which is pretty much what they did to Trump, and I'll explain how. And then we will move into Ralph's article this week, which is why conservatives should champion the gold standard, since obviously Biden isn't going to. So to begin, in my article, I talk about how the left has really perfected this fifth rule by Saul Alinsky, which is you just make a very powerful person who's on the other side of you look out to be an idiot. And what prompted me writing this article was my lefty friend keeps referring to Trump as Orange Man bad. And I think it's just stupid. I think it's silly. I don't think it's much of an insult. Trump looks fine. He just looks like an average, normal person. But the left has perfected this to such a way to where I now hear a lot of my friends on the right saying the same things the left is doing about Trump. How many of you have friends who are saying, well, Trump just couldn't keep his mouth shut. That's why he lost the election and we don't want him to run again in 2024. When in reality, people up until this most recent wave of wokeness, people have been talking like Trump talks for years. This was normal back in, say, the 1980s. Trump could have been president instead of Ronald Reagan, and nobody would have thought twice.
Excuse me. I would have thought 3 times. You're technically right. I would not have thought twice. I would have thought 3 times. But heavens to Betsy, Rachel, how can you possibly mention Donald Trump in the same breath as the great Ronald Reagan, who won the Cold War, dissolved this, put in motion the forces that would dissolve the Soviet Union, restored Americans' pride, Americans' prosperity, and actually did make America great again instead of just putting on a hat and making it into a slogan. Okay, to compare Reagan and Trump is a travesty. Trump is a grotesque caricature of Reagan at best.
Reagan would not have survived as well as he did in this area of social media scrutiny. Everything Reagan said would have been torn apart, dissected, made him to look like a fool. And then when he might have, been declining, like his last year in office, I don't know if he really was or wasn't, they would have made him out to be the worst imbecile ever, and he would have never gone down, ranked the 13th greatest president of all time. That's pretty much what historians agree on, and they
agree, but they're underrating him. He's up in the top 10, probably up in the top 5. So I have a bone to pick with those historians. But since they're all a bunch of screaming leftists, it just goes to show how great Reagan must have been if all of these screaming lefty academics have put him in the top 13 out of 46? So that's pretty impressive. That's in the top 25 or 30%. But the thing is, Rachel, you're too young to remember, but I worked for Reagan. I was a junior official in the Reagan White House, and I was back then when I was still a Democrat, I was the upstate, and 84, I was the upstate New York chairman of Democrats for Reagan during the election. And I was a Reagan, what do you call it? Proxy, not proxy, there's another word for it. I would go around and give speeches to places like the synagogue where everybody else was afraid to set foot, talking about how great Reagan was, but I, being a Jew, was fearless.
I know that, Ralph.
And by the way, I didn't change a single vote, but I was totally stymied them. They were like, oh my God, what a great argument for Reagan. We're not gonna vote for him, but that's really very respectable. We've never heard that before. That's because you listen to ABC, CBS, or NBC. And Rachel, what you don't know is they tore Reagan to flinders. There was before social media, but the mainstream media, the mass media, it was before CNN, it was before social media, but they were relentless. Newsweek, Time, and whatever. But Reagan had a great technique to combat that. And it's not, I happen to know this because I was, close to people who were close to him. I was, even though I was a White House official, there were 1,500 of us and I was on detail from the Department of Energy. So I didn't really get close to him very often. But do you know what Ronald Reagan's brilliant technique for neutralizing all of that ridicule, all that Alinsky and ridicule and negativity was?
Well, I do remember he was good with the jokes. The remark he made.
That wasn't it. He was good with the jokes. He had a great sense of humor, wonderful sense of humor. That wasn't it. Do you want to know what his secret recipe was?
Ignored it.
He turned down his hearing aid. Reagan was deaf without his hearing aid. And so whenever they started talking about him on TV or radio, he would just turn down the hearing aid and he would smile affably, completely immune to it. So I say, let's just turn down our hearing aids when the left is going bonkers, ridiculing us, because, there's a very old, this goes back even before my time, but I heard about it when I was very young. I'm going to pass on this gem of wisdom to you, Rachel Alexander. Write it down. This will serve you well. Sticks and stones could break my bones, but names will never hurt me.
That's not even true. I don't even believe that. All the people out there who have mental health issues because of bullying. I mean, I actually think that is a terrible statement, and it's just not true for most of us. We internalize things, and then it turns into physical, ailments for us. But here's why I have a problem. I know that people like Marjorie Taylor Greene aren't your favorite people, because she says things off.
I have a t-shirt. Wait a second, not so fair. I have a t-shirt that says "Secret Jewish Space Laser Corps Mazel Tov." So I can roll with the punches. I can get a good laugh out of it.
Okay, so here's the problem. If we just let all of that stuff go and pretend like it's not happening, what they're going to do is they're going to come after the rest of us. And if I hadn't run out of space in my column, I was going to point out a few people who are not known for saying things like MTG, who, if you go to their Wikipedia entry, there's almost nothing except one remark that's been taken way out of context to make them look bad. And let me give everyone an example so you can see what I'm talking about. Representative Debbie Lesko from Arizona, who we've all known for many years because she used to be in the state legislature. She is very well spoken. Nobody looks at her and says she's a radical, but on the other hand, she's not a rhino either. She's a wonderful conservative. She's barely been in the House, less than 2 years. And if you go to her Wikipedia entry, it's all about one bland remark she said about COVID. And so that's what they're going to do.
What did she say about COVID?
I don't even remember, because it was so normal. It was something like, we don't know everything there is to know about vaccines, or that's what's so insane about these people. We have to start calling them out and saying, no, that's not something that you can destroy somebody's career over, a rather neutral statement that they made. It's just like the whole Black Lives Matter movement. They call everything racist when everybody knows it's not all racist. And they're allowed to get away with it because we're sitting back going, sticks and stones can hurt our bones. And meanwhile, conservatives are getting canceled and fired from their jobs. That actually, words do turn into worse things.
Well, first of all, we're in agreement about Saul Alinsky. As our listeners know, I'm a huge fan of Saul Alinsky. I think he means radical in a good sense, getting to the root of things, not hooligan. He hated big government. He hated corporate cronyism. He hated social workers, and he carried concealed. So I love Saul Alinsky. But I once wrote a column when I was writing for Forbes before they shut down their political vertical, in which I actually critiqued Saul Alinsky for this very rule, Rule 5, which is ridicule is man's most potent weapon. It's also women's most potent weapon too, Rachel, so you should keep it handy just in case you ever need a really potent weapon. I said that it was Alinsky who let that ridicule genie out of the bottle, and it's really gotten out of hand. Now, to cut him a little bit of slack, but not completely, I'm not letting him off the hook on this, is as his acolyte, Hillary Rodham, who later turned into Hillary Rodham Clinton, wrote in her honors thesis at Wellesley, which was all about Saul Alinsky, that if you use Alinsky's tactics without Alinsky's ethics, you're a bad person. It's bad. These very powerful tactics have to be used ethically, meaning in pursuit of authentic justice and not disproportionately. So Alinsky, for instance, said that someone once came to him when he was doing a protest against some corporation, some racist corporation, that he was leading the community organizing against this racist corporation. And someone came to him and said, hey, this executive, and this was back in the 1960s, 1950s, the executive of this corporation likes boys, not girls, and I have the proof. And they had a satchel full of compromising information. And Alinsky shoved it aside and said, homie, don't play that.
Well, if it was really boys and not men, what we do have.
No, they were basically saying, we have the proof that he's a homosexual. It was not a pedophile.
Just clarifying.
Okay, that was just the lingo of the day. And Alinsky, a very decent guy, was unwilling to destroy this man socially and professionally, even in pursuit of his just cause. So I'm just letting you know that Alinsky was a real mensch. He was not a brute. He was not a thug, the way too many conservatives who just pick on him because he's got a Jewish last name.
No. We've gone over this many times. You know the problem I have with Alinsky. He is
not you, the others.
Line, and that's where I draw the line. I don't believe that we should ever use line. I do agree that some of his tactics, like ridicule, sure, but you know the
and some of his causes, like fighting racism, really, which got him, you know, the reason he carried concealed.
Fighting racism. What about his causes like big government and all these other left-wing causes? I mean,
he only did one big government thing in his entire life, and that was when Barry Goldwater asked him to oppose the Civil Rights Act of 1964. He said, racism is so terrible, we can't do nothing. Even though I hate big government, I'm not going to oppose it. Okay, but Saul Alinsky never did an affirmative single pro-big government thing in his life. He called Lyndon Johnson's war on poverty political pornography.
He wants government to make all these laws and rules. He was a Chavez guy.
You must have Saul Alinsky's evil twin brother, Saul Alinsky.
Okay, so you're going to tell me that Saul Alinsky did not want to increase the minimum wage?
I have never, ever. I've read his biographies. I've read his books. I know his son. I know his widow. Okay, and I know his grandchildren. And I've never heard anybody say that Saul Alinsky ever said a single word in favor of raising the minimum wage.
And unions, workers, that was his.
First of all, he was not a labor organizer. He was a community organizer. True fact.
Okay, that's fine. But
his mentor was John L. Lewis, the head of the United Mine Workers, and the founder of the Congress of Industrial Organizations. And John L. Lewis was a Republican supply sider. So,
but the thing that he lied about and bragged about in his book about lying had to do with an event that he was setting up that had to do with workers, and it occurred on a union special date.
Right.
So that's a very tight.
No, it just happened to be a coincidence, and the press asked him about it.
And he said, "No, I really chose this date."
He said, "I meant it," which was theatrical license, not a lie. He was not trying to mislead people to their detriment and his benefit, which is what constitutes a lie. You could look it up. It was pure theatrical license. And by the way, he had a wicked sense of humor, no question about it.
You are completely changing the definition of the word lie. At least if I tell a white lie, I call it a white lie. I will say, yes, I told a white lie. I don't just change the wording of it.
Oh, Rachel, that is so racist of you. A white lie, a white lie. Oh, shame on you. Just for our listeners who don't know any better, Rachel is the least racist white girl I have ever encountered in my life.
Oh, and if anybody, well, anyways, I'm not even going to go there. This is going somewhere we don't want to go. In fact, on that note, let's just move on and go to your interesting article, which is trying to convince Republicans to pick up the gold standard. And there was something about that article that I really wanted you to explain, but it'll come to me.
Okay, well, I encouraged Joe Biden, in my last 2 weeks ago, actually, article, to come out for the gold standard as a way of subduing inflation without causing a recession. So the gold standard is consistent with rising, not through a statutory minimum wage, but rising wages due to higher demand for labor due to great sizzling economic growth, so much so that the corporations can make an even better profit, even though they're paying their workers more, because the demand for their products, their goods and services is so much higher. So I published this in Newsmax 2 weeks ago. I'm sure Joe Biden must have read it. I'm sure Joe Biden must read Newsmax. Who doesn't read Newsmax?
He's one of the millions who watch our video show.
Yeah, there you go. And so I was very disappointed when I didn't get an announcement from the Oval Office saying that he was going to put us on the gold standard. But the silver lining to Biden's whiff on the gold standard is it opens the door for the Republicans to grab this as a fabulous campaign issue. And that means people like Glenn Youngkin, the governor-elect of Virginia, people like Rick DeSantis, the governor of Florida, and even the former governor of New Jersey, Chris Christie. Okay, they're all jockeying.
Okay,
they're all. I'm not a Christie fan. Okay, but they're all jockeying to get nominated for president, and they need all. Now they can grab the golden ticket and ride it all the way to the nomination and to the White House. So I'm now doubling down on my prescription of the gold standard, because under the gold standard, the dollar held its value for almost 200 years. And then when Nixon took us off the gold standard in 1971, the value of the dollar lost 85% of its purchasing power within about 10 years. So a 1981 dollar would have bought something like 15 cents of what a 1971 dollar had bought. Then Reagan came in, backed Volcker, they stabilized it, and brought inflation down from 10% to 2%, where it's gone for 40 years. But now it's blipped back up thanks to Jerome Powell, and thanks to Donald Trump, and thanks to Joe Biden, by having a dovish Fed with ridiculously low interest rates. We're now getting inflation's gone up to almost 6%, the highest level in 30 years. So how do we end that up? We bring the classical gold standard back. We put it into place with a $2,000 an ounce $2,000 an ounce gold, thereby stabilizing the value of the dollar once again forever, for 10 years, for 50 years, for 100 years, and getting the growth rate back up to the 4% that we enjoyed under Clinton and the high 3% that we enjoyed under Reagan, and we haven't seen since. So monetary policy it's invisible like oxygen, but it is crucial to the fires of industry and the health of the economy. And so we've had bad monetary policy since George W. Bush, since Obama, and since Trump, and now under Biden, and we are paying the price for it. And the chickens are coming home to roost. It's inflation, and the gold standard is the best and most popular way out of that to restore fabulous economic growth in a zero inflation climate.
Okay, so
Newsmax, check it out.
What I remembered that I wanted you to explain is, can you explain why some people, the vast majority of people, object to going back on the gold standard, and what you would say in return to them?
Okay, first of all, I would dispute your premise. The vast majority of people are not against the gold standard, a majority of people, regular rank and file pesky voters like you and me, are pro gold standard. Rasmussen polled this about 10 years ago. It's not a current issue that keeps getting polled, and discovered that the number one enthusiastic body in favor of the gold standard was the blacks. The second most enthusiastic was union members, blue collar workers, and the third most enthusiastic were Hispanics. If you just asked them point blank, are you for the gold standard or not? Very much so, yes or no. Then most of the working people intuitively understand that the gold standard done right is good for them, and the majority of voters are for the gold standard. Would you like to know who's against the gold standard?
White liberal.
Progressives. The progressives are majority anti-gold standard, but they're about 15% of the electorate. They're really loud, okay? They get all the attention and they got most of the money, okay? But they are a tiny fraction of the voters. And so, right, the economists, 40 out of 40 elite economists that were polled by the Booth School about 10 years ago, not just are against the gold standard, they ridicule it. I quote Austin Goolsbee, 40 out of 40, only 3 of whom were monetary economists, by the way. So it's just a prejudice on their part. If you actually look at the track record of the gold standard, there's this wonderful new book out called The Gold Standard, Retrospective and Prospect, in Retrospect and Prospect, by a gentleman named Earl, a financier named Earl, and by an economist named Luther. And they put together essays by about 10 serious economists, guys like George Selgin and Larry White, really good guys. And they have 10 rigorous essays talking about how the gold standard really performed in practice, not in theory. And you know what, I'm a yogi, right? You know I'm a follower of yoga. And you know what the greatest yogi of them all once said? Yogi Berra. In theory, there's no difference between theory and practice, but in practice, there is. So it turns out that for all of the theoretical academic hostility to the gold standard, if you actually look at the track record of keeping inflation down, keeping growth up, and keeping equity up so that working people are rising into the middle class, and it's not all going to the top 1%, the gold standard runs rings around the Fed standard, the paper money Fed standard that we've been stuck with for the last 50 years. And it's not just these guys. The Bank of England published a paper in 2011, Financial Stability Report number 13 for you geeks out there, that found the exact same thing. The gold standard and the gold exchange standard massively outperformed the paper money standard in terms of the benefits to working people, the growth of the economy, and the ability for money to keep its value, be a store of value. So that's what I would say to people who go, no, the gold standard, it's nuts. It's like, well, you think it's nuts, but the evidence is all to the contrary, and I'll put my evidence up against yours any day.
Well, would you say the main objection to the gold standard is that people want to be able to continue to throw paper money into the economy,
No.
mess with interest rates, and
no, that's not, no. But I'll tell you exactly what the reason is because after World War I, they replaced the classical gold standard, which had worked beautifully for 50 years, creating prosperity everywhere it was tried. Relative prosperity, nothing is perfect, and the gold standard wasn't perfect, but better than anything else that had ever been tried. They replaced it with a grotesque caricature of the gold standard in a conference called Genoa that was engineered by John Maynard Keynes, your buddy, the first celebrity economist. They created something called the gold exchange standard that made the pound as good as gold, and they could settle accounts among nations with paper money, the pound and the dollar, instead of gold. And that caused a 50% inflation in commodities prices, but gold was pinned down to $20.67 an ounce. And so that perverse disorder is what precipitated the Great Depression but this is really esoteric geek stuff. People then and people now don't know the difference between the classical gold standard and the gold exchange standard. So the gold standard was blamed for the Great Depression. And that gave it a PR black eye. And so my parents, God rest their souls, my father was born in 1910, my mother was born in 1919. They lived through the Great Depression. I said, what caused the Great Depression? And they said, the gold standard. It just became conventional wisdom. And they were simple people. I mean, my father was a lawyer, my mother was a teacher. They were bright, but this is, sort of esoteric monetary economics, which most normal people, unlike say me, an abnormal person, don't really understand very much about. But if you really want to get down to the story, the narrative behind it, go out and buy Liaquat Ahmed's book, The Lords of Finance, The Bankers Who Broke the World. It won the Pulitzer Prize, and it is the best story about how the system had gotten put out of whack, who did it, how they did it, what it caused, and when George Warren, who was the greatest commodities economist of his day, told FDR that he needed to revalue gold, revalue the dollar from $20.67 an ounce to $35 an ounce. FDR didn't know what he was doing, but he did it. He sat in the bathroom, he sat in the bathtub every morning, and he picked numbers. I'm going to raise the price of gold by 21 cents today, because 3 times 7, these are lucky numbers. It was coy, okay? But the main thing is, for however he did it and however idiotically he did it, God forgive me for besmirching the great reputation of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, okay? Immediately when the price of the dollar went to $35 an ounce instead of $20 an ounce, the depression immediately began to lift. Industrial production went up by 100% within months. The stock market went up. Everything went up. Durable goods went up. Unfortunately, FDR had no idea what the heck he had just done. And so his Treasury Department started sterilizing the gold inflows instead of rolling with it. And that pushed the United States back into a double dip depression, wherein we languished until we got into World War II, which is another story. War does not end depression, as Hemingway pointed out. But I'm just saying, all of that stuff, the Great Depression happened. It was actually Woodrow Wilson changed the standards, okay? But the stock market crash happened after the Roaring '20s on Herbert Hoover's watch. And of course, he was the guy who, Will Rogers coined the ridicule phrase, trickle-down economics, which then the Democrats ended up using against us supply-siders. And since Herbert Hoover was our whipping boy, his economics were terrible. Read The Way the World Works and you'll understand why. That just gave the gold standard a terrible black eye. And then afterwards, we at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, at Hotel Washington, they recreated another gold standard, another gold exchange standard, but these worked for a while, just like Genoa worked to create the Roaring '20s. And we had the post-war boom of 4 or 5% growth with very little inflation. So I recommended to Mr. Biden through my column, I haven't actually had the pleasure of meeting the man, that he reconstitute a Bretton Woods 2 to bring back the real gold standard, not the gold exchange standard. And either he ignored me or he hasn't gotten the memo yet. Maybe it's still working its way through the bureaucracy. Maybe there will be a national address from the Resolute desk one of these days announcing the restoration of the gold standard. But Rachel, forgive my pessimism, but I'm not optimistic that Joe Biden is going to bring us forward to the classical gold standard. But I hope a Republican presidential nominee will do that, because they'll immediately get the entire Ron Paul vote. Okay, the entire Newt Gingrich came out for a gold commission when he was running, and it's a very, very sexy issue, and it's a sort of tabletop issue that a lot of people go, yeah, of course, gold, that's really valuable.
you keep saying sexy. I mean, maybe we need to sex it up a bit more. You know, when people think of gold, they do think sexy, but
Yeah,
but all we ever see is like bars of gold when you talk about this issue. So you might be onto something. And I just have a couple points to make.
bring
Um,
them on.
First of all, can you tell our viewers exactly what years we were on a gold standard? And two, have you written a review of that book you recommend? And if not, could
Yeah, no, that was my Newsmax column today.
no, but I
Okay.
mean like the whole book. I mean,
Yes, it's a 800-word review of the whole book. It's chapter by chapter, The Gold Standard by Earl and Luther. It's a short review, but it's got a very sexy opening and very sexy closing, and then it just touches base on each chapter of this wonderful book.
I haven't read it yet. I mean, I read your column that is asking Republicans to jump on the gold standard. So this is a different.
And this is the guidebook. No, this is, if you read my column today,
Yes.
and you're forgiven, because if you haven't, I did a column last week telling Biden to go to the gold standard, and did a column today, 2 weeks ago.
Yeah.
That was Biden. I did a column today telling the Republicans, since Biden didn't move on my wonderful advice, it's time for them to grab it and run with it. And so, and to use this book as their guidebook as to how to do it, because this book really gets it right. It's the best book on how to do the gold standard since Lou Lerman's book called The True Gold Standard of about 20 years ago. But this comes from professional economists rather than a businessman philanthropist. Lerman is brilliant. He was my mentor, and his mentor was Jacques Rueff, the great classical gold standard economist who advised Charles de Gaulle when he was president of France. Okay, but it can't be said often enough. This book, The Gold Standard, is the perfect guidebook for an ambitious politician who wants to crush inflation, get rid of inflation without causing a recession, bringing about economic growth, and propel his way into the White House and a golden age of equitable prosperity under the gold standard. And I wouldn't mind a few more tax cuts for working people while he was at it.
Okay, I just want to make sure we got enough links under our video for our viewers so they can read enough about the book.
Go to Newsmax, go to Ralph Benko, go to December 6th, and go to Biden whiffs, and you'll be able to find the column. And it was done by AIER, but you can also buy it on Amazon. Highly recommended.
And when throughout the whole entire history of the country, especially the 20th century, have we actually been on the gold standard?
We were on what was called the bimetallic standard, technically, which was gold and silver from the day the country was formed until 1971. So almost 200 years. We were on bimetallism until 1900, theoretically, but in reality, we were on the gold standard because they overvalued silver a little bit, so we imported gold and exported silver. I don't want to get too technical about it, but the Wizard of Oz was really a parable about the gold standard, because in the book, Dorothy was wearing silver slippers, not ruby slippers, and she was on the long, winding yellow brick road. And back in the day when L. Frank Baum, who also invented department store windows, came up with this wonderful parable, William Jennings Bryan was giving this speech: you shall not crucify, you shall not press down this crown of thorns upon labor's brow, you shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold, which was another black eye the gold standard had, because after the Civil War, prices had gone up by 50%, and the bankers said, well, we're going to resume the value of the dollar at pre-war parity, causing a horrible long depression that was agony for the farmers, scarecrow, and for the industrial laborers, Tin Man. And so this caused an enormous amount of misery, which was not due to the gold standard. It was due to not resuming the gold standard at the post-war parity instead of the pre-war parity. But by the way, William Jennings Bryan was the guy who prosecuted Scopes for teaching evolution in the public schools. So people who want to quote William Jennings Bryan Cross of Gold speech, he was he was a notorious creationist, which you probably are too, but that's okay because I can top that. I'm a flat earther.
So to pretty much wrap up, when you were saying we've been on the gold standard up until 1971, you pointed out a couple of instances where even though we were on the gold standard, we made some major adjustments, like when you were saying in the late 1800s, changing the value of the dollar.
War always disrupts the gold standard. It's a law of nature. And whether it's a civil war, whether it was World War I, the disruption is not the problem. The problem is you don't have enough experts who understand how to get back to it without causing a recession or a depression. And unfortunately, we had a deficit there. But thanks to Earl and Luther, it's very clear now, and Selgin and White, we no longer have a deficit of competent classical liberal economists who can bring us forward to the gold standard in a way that is pro-prosperity and pro-equity. This book is a major breakthrough.
Okay, I think that pretty much wraps it up for us. Thank you all of our viewers for watching, and tune in with us next week.
Live long and prosper, Rachel Alexander, and all of our millions of viewers.